I was making an eye tutorial, and as I was finishing, Blender updated to 4.2, bringing some very cool changes to Eevee and the node tools, but my video ended up a bit behind. Plus it was like an hour and a half long, so screw it, I'll make another updated one. And this is it. So I know what you're thinking, do we really need another procedural eye tutorial? Yes you do, because I've added a few extra things that I think makes this asset a lot more interesting and useful. So if you stick around, you'll see what I mean. Okay, let's go. First things first, I want to address something. If you've ever used a procedural eye asset, you've probably noticed your scene slowing down. Well, that's because they use a lot of noise textures in the material, and believe it or not, those are quite heavy. We are going to do a few tricks to make our asset a lot more lightweight. First, we're not going to use object mapping for the noise, we're going to use UV. That way we can use the 2D texture, which is lighter than the 3 and 4D textures. These things alone will improve the performance a lot. The other thing is, simply don't overcomplicate the material. You don't really need 1,000 layers of textures for something that is going to be viewed from afar in most cases. But of course, that's up to you. Just know that the more procedural textures you add, the heavier it will become. Okay, I'm not gonna model the eye like this. I'm going to use geometry nodes to generate the eye model. I know, you're surprised, but there is a reason, as you'll see later in the video. It's gonna make our job so much easier. So to any object, add a new geometry node setup. We're not gonna use this geometry, we're gonna use a UV sphere. For one, the eyes are spheres, but also this has a UV map ready to go that we can use here in the node setup. Over here we can determine the resolution of the mesh. Usually the rings are half as many as the segments, so here's what we'll do. Make an input for the rings. I'll call it mesh resolution. Then to get the segments, multiply this by 2. That way it's easier to control the mesh density. Before we proceed, we have to set material. Select the material. I'll rename it to eye material. We should also set the shading to smooth. There. Now, I want this region to be the iris, so we can rotate the mesh with a transform geometry. Usually when we import characters, they look towards -y, so that's how we're going to orient our eye. Rotate along the x-axis by -90. There. Now, if we look for a UV map, there doesn't seem to have one. That's because, while yes, this has a UV map, we need to store it as an attribute. So, store named attribute to the vector, face corner, let's give it a name, UV map, then plug the UV into the value. But there still doesn't seem to have it. That's because, weirdly, we have to capture it first. So capture attribute. I like this new one, it's so much more convenient. We are capturing on the face corner domain. Then we simply transfer the UV to the store. And there we are. Let me just change the view transform to standard, because this is a bit too washed out. Now, the seam here, and yeah, there's going to be a seam. If we place it near the top of the eye, it won't be very noticeable. Most of the time, it's going to be hidden by the top lid, if you can even see it. So we can rotate on Y here and place it near the top. If you want to be really pedantic, we can make it so that it sits on the top of the eye, no matter what the resolution we set. To do that, we need to get the angle of one section, which is 360 divided by the number of segments, which is this thing right here. In this case, it's 32. So let's divide by the number of segments. 360 in math terms is 2 pi, or we can type tau, same thing. Then, to rotate just the y, we need to combine x, y, z in here. Minus 90 is negative pi divided by 2. Then this angle is one increment. To get the top, we need to multiply it by the proper amount of segments, which is a quarter of the total. Plus or minus 1, we'll see. So multiply the segments. 1/4 is 0.25. This goes in here. Alright, it seems to be negative 0.25. And now we need to add or subtract 1. So let's change this to multiply add 1. No, negative 1. There we are. Now, no matter what the resolution is, the seam will always be on the top. There it will be most hidden. I'll organize everything by framing these nodes. That's the eye geometry. Going back to the material, a useful thing to have is a gradient running the length of the eye. We can create one from the UV, separate x, y, z, and it's the y coordinate. We want to be able to contrast this gradient, so over here I'll add a map range. Now, as we bring these two values closer to 0.5, we will get a more contrasty gradient. To control them both, we can use a mix node. Now, if both of them are 0.5, there will be some ambiguity over which is which, so instead of 0.5, let's use a little less, like 0.499. For the max value, we can subtract this, 1 minus the mix value, in here. This is now a contrast control. Let's group all these, and let's make an input for the contrast slider. This group we can call a contrast value. Okay, to move the boundary, we can add to the gradient. Let's clamp it so to keep it normalized. The move value is from negative 0.5 to positive 0.5. Let's control that with a mix from negative 0.5 to 0.5. With this, we can easily create masks for the iris, the pupil, and others. But here, when the contrast is 0, these position values need to be different, otherwise it doesn't work. These ones, when the contrast is 0, need to be negative 1 and 1. Now we have the full position range. And we have to control both of them at the same time. So I'm gonna group all these, and the node group we'll call a gradient. Now we can make an input for the contrast and use it to control the position values. So another mix. As we said, when the contrast is 0, the max position is 1, at full contrast it's 0.5. Now this is the positive value. for the negative, we can just multiply this by -1. This will automatically adjust the position values based on the contrast. Okay, let's make an input for the position. Here I'll enlarge everything so you can see the whole setup. And this is for the contrast node. Now we'll start by creating the sclera, which is the white part of the eye. This gradient we can use for a mixed color. Here we'll pick the sclera colors. For the back we want a slightly dark orangey red, and this is a slightly yellowish white, like off-white. Now, as you can see, the gradient is linear, which is not that appealing. So in our gradient node, at the end here, we can add a map range and set it to smooth step. That creates a bit more pleasant gradient. Okay, so this is the sclera base. Now let's group everything into a node group. That way we can create inputs for our material. I'll name the main group Eye Shader. We can start by creating a panel for our sclera. Then let's make inputs for the redness here and the redness contrast. But when I increase the redness, the eye becomes more white, where it should be the other way around. So the redness control I'll plug into a mix as the factor, then just change this to be from 1 to 0, so the other way around. Now, as we increase the redness, we actually get more red. Okay, there we go. I will place these two controls into the sclera panel. There it is. The sclera panel, we can make it closed by default. We can make inputs for the two colors. I'll name them base color and redness color. While we are here, let's make inputs for the roughness and the specular. There we are. We can now tidy this up by framing these nodes. Next, we should make the veins for the sclera. To begin to make them, we're going to need our first noise texture. As we said before, we're going to use the 2D texture and map it to the UV coordinates. In order to create the streaks of the veins, we can scale down our noise texture on Y, like so, maybe to about 0.1. There we are. Here you can see the seam is barely visible, so we shouldn't really worry about it. We can distort this noise by having another noise texture, map it to UV as well. Then we can mix these two with a mixed color. You can see a major distortion, but we need to set the mix to linear light. It's way too strong, so we should limit this to some low value. I'd say about here, 0.1 at maximum. We can control this with a mix node from 0 to 0.1. There we are. Let's group all these and call the node group Radial Noise. Make an input for the distort. We should also make inputs for the noise settings without the distortion. I'm gonna make a noise panel for these and distortion panel for these. Make the inputs and move them to the noise panel. Let's also have the distortion noise settings into the distortion panel. And now this radial noise node group is going to be very useful to create the veins of the sclera. Here is the whole node setup inside. Okay, let's use it for the veins. I'm gonna mix with the base of the sclera. Let's multiply this with the gradient. Alright, we have the veins. We just need to remove them from the front here. We can use the gradient itself and simply add it to the texture. Alright, so that's something that we want. Let's just clamp it so this map stays normalized, like so. Let's see it with the color. Yeah, there we are. Lastly, let's have a control over the strength of the veins by mixing this texture with the regular gradient. There, no veins. Full strength. Okay. Let's create the controls for the veins. I will make another panel for them. This is the veins strength. We are also gonna create controls for some of these noise settings. First, the veins scale. The detail we can set to 3, and the roughness could be the detail amount. Then let's do the distortion and the distortion noise settings in a similar fashion. Move them all into the veins panel. With this, we are going to have control over the veins texture. And this whole thing goes into the color of the BSDF. Okay, now we should start making the iris. Let's begin by adding a new gradient node that we can use to create the iris mask. The position here shouldn't be more than a half, right? We don't want the iris to be bigger than the eyeball. Also, the contrast, I mean, this is way too washed out for an iris mask. It should be around here at the minimum. So let's control these two with mix nodes. The position was 0.5 at maximum, and the contrast 1 at maximum, and 0.9 at minimum. There. and the size. Right, let's make another panel for the iris. And let's make input for the iris size and the iris contrast. I'll frame this and call it iris mask. We can use this mask for a mix with the Sclera texture. The mask goes into the factor. And now this color is going to be for the iris texture. So let's make this iris texture and plug it in here. First, we're going to need a pupil. This is going to be another gradient mask, like the iris. So let's copy these nodes. These are going to be for the pupil mask. Now, the size of the pupil should be at its maximum, the same as the iris, right? We don't want our pupil to be bigger than the iris. So in the maximum for the position here, let's plug the iris size value, like so. Now this limits the size of the pupil to whatever the size of the iris is. Okay, let's make the two inputs for these as well. Now, to create the pupil hole, it's another mix node, the pupil mask. The first one is the iris color, the bottom one is the pupil. You can make it any color if you are making something crazy, otherwise it should be black. Then connect it to the iris texture slot. Okay, there we are. It starts to resemble an eye. One thing to note, if we look at the pupil, there is a specular reflection here that shouldn't be there, because it's a hole, there's nothing there. So we can use the pupil mask to drive the specular. Use it for a mix node and plug it into the index of refraction. Now the top value is the specular for the eye, so plug it in, and the bottom one is for the pupil, so leave it at 0. So there, no matter what we set here, there's not going to be any reflection in the pupil. Before, after. There we go. Now, if you look at a reference of an eye, you can see a region in the center that kind of looks like this. Like this wavy boundary. This is called the pupillary zone. And this is the ciliary zone. The boundary between them is called the collarette. The best way to create this center spot is with a Voronoi texture. We want it to be two-dimensional as well. And again, map it to the UV coordinates. We can give it a little stretch, but not too much, around 0.5. We want it to be just in the center. So let's grab another gradient. We want our spot to be somewhere in here. So let's control these two with mix nodes. The contrast shouldn't be too washed out. So let's say from 0.5 to 1. As far for the position, we want it to be limited by the iris size as well, like we did for the pupil. To properly mix this with the Voronoi, we should add them together. Also, let's make sure we clamp this, something like that, except we need to control the values of the gradient. Let's grab another mix node. Here we can set the values to be from 1 to 0. Okay, kinda invert the gradient. We do get a spot, except it's a bit weak. What we can do is decrease the lower bound of the gradient. We should choose a value, I'd say around -8. The gradient contrast kinda controls the detail of the spot, and this is the size of it. The Voronoi we can contrast a bit, like so. And finally we can contrast the overall spot. Now this whole thing we can use to create the two color zones of the iris. Let's use another mix node. The ciliary color could be something like this green, darkish, and the pupillary zone, some dark brown, create kinda like hazel eyes. These are just going to be the defaults. Okay, click this and let's see. I'll adjust the color a bit. Also make the spot bigger. Now to create the inputs for these, let's make another panel for the iris colors. Make the two color inputs and give them their name. There, we can change them from here. Let's frame the nodes for the pupillary zone mask. I'll move everything up a bit to make room for the other stuff. Here I'll show you the node setup for this. Now, to make the sort of sinewy structure of the iris, we could use another of our radial noise textures right here, and we can mix it with the iris colors. Okay, let's use another mix node. The noise goes at the bottom, and we change the mix to overlay, and this will be the strength of this effect. Okay, let's see with everything. Alright, I'm going to drop the distortion a bit. Over here at the factor, if we unclamp it, we can actually go beyond 1, and this will make the effect more vivid. Let's set the control for this with a mix node from 0 to, let's say, 1.5. Alright. We should make the inputs for the noise here. I'll make some room. These are going to be for the iris texture. So let's make another panel for them. These should be in the iris color. Okay, and I'll make one for the iris texture. So let's have the strength setting. The noise scale and detail. And also the settings for the distortion. Let's not forget to add our pupillary zone settings. This is kind of like the detail level. And this will be for the overall contrast of the pupillary zone. As for the Voronoi, we probably only need its scale It controls the scale of the colorette, the boundary of the spot. Place them in the iris texture panel as well. Now, usually there's like a shadow at the boundary of the iris. This we can make with the same sort of mask as the one for the iris. So let's copy these nodes over here, and this should be the sort of mask for the shadow. Just when I increase this, the dark should come into the eye. Alright, so let's flip the values, and again, let's limit the minimum this time to be the iris size value. Now, as I increase this, the shadow will creep in from the border of the iris. Alright, now let's mix this with the iris color, with this one right here. Another mix. Then the shadow mask goes at the bottom slot, and the mix should be multiply. There we are, we have a shadow. Okay, looking good so far. I'm gonna organize a bit. Let's now make inputs for this border. We can name this control the Ciliary shadow, and this is its contrast. This right here is the strength of the shadow. I'll place them in the iris color span. Our next job should be to create some bump in the iris. For that, we're going to use the normal socket of the BSDF, and in it we'll plug a bump node. The height here should be the noise texture of the iris. Where is it? Right here. This one we plug into the height of the bump. Let's see. This is way too strong. Let's lower the strength. Okay, we obviously don't want it back here. So in the distance here, we can plug a mask. That mask should be the one for the iris. Alright, now with this mask we can use a mix node. And the mix goes into the distance. It sets a maximum distance for the bump. I'd say about 0.1. And we can control the strength from here. The pupillary zone usually sits underneath, so we can add it to the bump map. Let's find the mask for it. This one. Then let's add it to the iris noise and plug it into the height. Alright, there we are. This looks much better. I mean, it doesn't hold scrutiny from up close, but from afar, it's alright. Let's make an input for the bump strength. I will place it in the iris texture panel. Okay, let's organize here a bit. For the mucousy layer on top of the eye, we can make a separate mesh and set it to be transparent. But we don't actually need to do that, because over here we can add a clear coat layer. Boom, there it is. And the cool thing is, this sits on top of everything, so it doesn't get affected by the bump. Which makes sense, right? The iris is beneath this layer, but it has its own normal input, which we can use for the veins bump, because they do show on the surface of the eye. Alright, let's use another bump node. Plug it in the normal of the coat. Then again, for the height, we're going to use the veins mask. This thing right here. So plug it into the bump. And let's see. Alright, so it seems the veins are pushing into the eye. Let's invert here so they push out, okay? And lower the distance. This looks about right. With the possibility that if we increase the veins, the bump will bleed into the iris. Okay, we don't want that. So let's mask out the iris from the veins bump. We can copy this mix node that comes from the iris mask and plug it into the distance. This top slot is for the veins. The bottom one is 0. There we are. Now there won't be any veins bump in the iris region. Okay, let's make an input for the strength of the veins bump and place it in the veins panel. Let me just quickly change all the panels to close by default. Okay, frame these, veins bump. So you can pretty much use this now. As an eye, it will work. However, I want to go a bit further. I want to add a few more features that will make this asset a bit more special. Very often, when we make stylized characters, we don't necessarily want a circular iris. Sometimes we want like a squished oval shape. That would be quite hard to make with the shader. However, we can actually squish the mesh geometry, and that will drag all the textures with it, including the veins and everything. It will make a really nice deformation. So how can we do that? Let's get back to geometry nodes. If we rotate the points of the mesh, each point we rotate around the center of the sphere, and the points on the sides have to rotate in opposite direction, we should be able to squish the front of the eye. Now, because we are going to move points, let's set position. Okay, now we use the position field and then we rotate it with a rotate vector. Okay, now we should rotate on Z, but as I said, both halves of the eye have to counter rotate, so we need a mask for that. We can separate our position with a separate XYZ, and then we use the X coordinate. That gives us this mask that splits the eye in half. Okay, now we need to plug this into the Z here. So let's expose this with a combined XYZ and plug it into the Z. Alright, but it stretches it. So let's control this with a multiply. Now, as we go negative, we get our iris squish. Here you can see how it's moving the mesh. Alright, let's control this with a mix node. At the maximum, it should be somewhere around -0.8. There it is. Let's make an input for this. This will be the iris squish, right here from the modifier. I'll just organize these. Now, eyes are not really a perfect sphere. They usually have a bulge in the front, like this. Of course, these are stylized eyes, we don't have to do that, but let's at least have the option to. Let's bring up another set position. This time we want to move the points back and forth, so we're going to use the offset on Y. Okay, let's combine XYZ to expose it. Then let's create another mask from the position. I'll just copy these two. We want the Y coordinate this time. Okay, plug it into the Y of the offset. And we've stretched the eye. Let's control this with a multiply. And we only want to move the front of the eye, so we have to mask out the back. For that, we're going to need to change our mask here. Over here it's negative, and here it's positive. We need to remap that. So let's use a map range. Okay, now this goes from -1 to +1. So let's reflect that in the map range. Then we want to change the 2 min and max values. We want the front to be +1 and the back here to be 0. Okay, but the black has to start from the center of the eye. So let's move this from max to be 0, because 0 was the center of the sphere. Now it goes from -1 to 0, and that turns to 1 to 0. This whole back region has a value of 0. Okay, let's see that in action. There, we only move the front of the eye. And here we have to go negative this time. Okay, but it kinda looks like an egg. We can control the shape of the bulge by raising our map to a power. When I increase the exponent, you can see it gets more pointy. And this is how far. Okay, let's control these two with mixed nodes. This one goes to, let's say, -0.5. The exponent here, let's make it up to 10. And it should start from 1. Let's make inputs for these two. The bulge and the bulge shape. I'll make a panel for these. Let's say cornea. Okay, here we go. Now, if you want another eye, you can copy it, and there we are, we have another eye. But we can actually do this from here and have both eyes ready to go. So to duplicate any object, first we turn it into an instance, geometry to instance. Okay, then we use duplicate elements, not points. We want to duplicate the whole instance. Okay, then we make 2 copies. You can see them here. Right now they're on top of each other. So let's move them with translate instances. We want to move them on the x-axis, so side to side. Then we can use the instance indices to move them separately. This is what I mean. Let's expose the translation with a combine XYZ. Then plug this duplicate index into the X. And now the first eye doesn't move, and the other eye moves by 1, which is its index. Now we can remap this with a mix node. The index goes into the factor. Now the first eye is going to have this value, and this is for the other eye. Let's set them to be -1 and 1. Okay, so we have opposite movement. Then let's multiply this to have the control. So there, we've created 2 eyes with the ability to set the distance between them. Now we should make this a choice. Let's use a switch node, and we're going to switch between the two eyes and the single instance. There. Now let's make the inputs. This is the switch to create two eyes. And over here we have the distance between the eyes. We can control the size of the eyes by using a scale instances node. Now look, if you want to control each eye individually, we can use the same trick with the indices. From this mix node, you can control the scale of each eye. So do that if you want. I will just create a single size input for both of them. Next, what we can do is make a way to direct the eyes in a certain direction. You can of course rig them, but then you can't use the two eyes because they both rotate. So we have to do that from the geometry nodes. Because we are going to rotate the eyes, let's use rotate instances. Then we need an object for them to look at, so I'll bring up an empty. Then I'll drag the empty into the node tree. Now we need to align the rotation of our eyes in the direction of the target object. So this is the align rotation to vector, which is the replacement for the align Euler to vector, which is now considered deprecated as of Blender 4.2. So this is it, connected to the rotation. Then our vector is the target's location. Alright, we have to align the y-axis of the eyes, but they look away from the object. So let's fix that by scaling the location by -1. And now they look in the correct direction. We can use this object to steer the gaze. Alright, now when I move the eyes, they keep looking in the direction we've set. This is because we are using the original transformation of the target object. If we set it to relative, they will keep track of the target as I move them. And the other thing is, right now, this object only sets the direction of the look. That's because the alignment vector is just the location of the target object. That vector looks like this. So that's how our eyes orient. If we want the eyes to focus on that location, we need to change the vector to be from the origin of each eye towards the target object. To create those, we can use the subtract vector math node. When we subtract two positions, it creates a vector that goes from the bottom position towards the top position. And we want to build this vector. So that's from the position of the eye towards the target's location. So we can plug that into the top socket. And if we use that vector now for the align rotation, each eye is going to look towards the target independently. Now, it's a good idea to make this into a choice, so we can mix between these two vectors with a mix vector node. And now this slider is going to change the behavior. Either set the direction or look towards the target. Okay, now let's create an input for that. I'll make a panel for the eye movement controls. The target object should be an input, so you can pick it from the modifier. Then we can have this slider to change between the direction or target mode. Here is the node setup for the eye movement section. Okay, this is pretty much done. However, there's one more thing that I want to implement. Very often, when we create these stylized characters, they have very big eyes. As such, when we place the eye inside the socket, it kinda bulges out too much. It makes it look weird. It would be useful if we make the eye less spherical, meaning if we squish it like that, it's not going to bulge that much. And the cool thing about geometry nodes is, because these effects are one after another, we can still move the eyes without rotating the squished geometry. First it gets rotated, then scaled. Okay, but this is a bit limited. We can only scale in this axis. We want a way to scale along any axis to better align it to the shape of the face. We essentially need a directional scale. So let's do that. We've been working with instances so far, so let's first realize them. That way we are back to a mesh object. Now we set position again. We are going to move the points on Y, and we also need the position components for a mask, specifically the Y component. Then we expose the offset vector and plug the Y into the Y. Right, now we use a multiply for the control. Now if we use -1, we would collapse the eye into a single plane, so we'll have these clipping artifacts. Let's instead use a little less, so we don't get that. Okay, and we can control that with a mix node. Now, if we want to change the direction in which the eye is squished, we have to rotate the squishing mask. We can do that by rotating the position vector. But we can't use rotate vector because that rotates the positions along the object center. Instead, we should rotate the positions of each eye along its own center. So instead of this, we should use a vector rotate, because here we can specify the center of the rotation. Also, I'll change the rotation type to be Euler. And now, for the center, we want the position of the eyes. But we can't use this position here, because that's the position of the points. What we want is the position of the eye as an instance. So let's make some room. Here, before the realize, we can capture attribute, make sure it's on instance, then capture the position. Okay, now this can be our center. There it is. We can rotate this mask on any axis. Now, as I rotate this on Z, it does a weird stretching. That's because we are still deforming only on the Y-axis. The mask is rotated, but the deformation is still only on Y. We need to rotate this deformation vector by the same amount as the mask. So let's do that with another vector rotate. Now let's make an input so we can control both rotations at the same time with a combined XYZ node. But this doesn't quite work. That's because we kinda need to invert one of the rotations. Let's say this one. Okay, and there we are. We can now properly rotate the scaling direction. And as you can see, we are not rotating the object itself. we just rotate the orientation in which it is squished. However, we are rotating both eyes in the same direction, but of course, our head from the top will look something like this. So the squishing has to be in different directions to follow the curvature of the face. In a sense, we need to counter-rotate. So remember, when we wanted opposite effects on either eye, we used this mix node from the indices. So I'll use it in one of the rotation values. There we are. Now we simply need to multiply this, and we have a counter rotation, so we can align it better to our face. Alright, let's make one for each axis. Now we can start making the inputs for these rotations. So this value is for the X rotation. Let's place them in a panel. I'll call it eye geometry. Now this is for the counter rotation. If we simply use the input, rotates in the same direction. So let's make a switch between these two. That way we can choose when to counter rotate. Okay, let's have it as an input. Counter rotate X. There it is. Okay, now we just have to make the same thing for the other two axes. There we are. And let's not forget the squish control. Now, if we don't want to squish the back of the eye, we need to somehow change the deformation map so that we mask out the back. Let's take a look at it. Right now the mask is negative down here and positive up here. If we use a minimum node, set the value to 0, the mask is 0 at the midpoint. Anything above 0 will be ignored and the minimum will output 0 for those regions. The negative region will maintain its value. Right, so let's connect this and see. There we are. Let's make this a choice. So I'll make some room here. And we are going to switch between these two. This gives us a choice to mask out the back of the eye from the squishing. Let's give it an input. I'll just organize this now. Frame all of these. And you know what? That's it. I'd say we have a very cool eye asset that's going to work for stylized characters. Now let me show you how we can place this on your character. I'm going to use the monkey for this example. Just gonna give it some subdivision and apply it. I'm going to remove the eyes, and this is how they actually look like, but let's just delete them because we are going to use our own eyes. So select the eye object. We can use these two settings to scale them and bring them closer together until they roughly match the size of the character. Then I'll manually place them near the eye sockets. And here you can see what I've talked about. They just bulge out too much. So let's squish them from here. Right, let's see. About this much. Okay, I'll drop the size a little bit more. Right. It seems the bump is a bit too much, so let's drop it a bit from the material settings down here in the iris texture panel. Okay. Now you can see the gap here between the eye and the eye socket, so let's adjust the angle of the squish. I'll rotate it on Z until it matches the angle of the face. Okay, this looks much better. We still may need to adjust the face mesh slightly to fill up some gaps, so I'll sculpt on the character, trying to follow the eye, just slightly. There. We can direct the look without actually rotating the geometry itself, which is helpful because the eye is not a sphere now. See, no change in the overall shape, it's just the mesh shifting around, but it looks like it's rotating the eyes. We can adjust the strength of the veins here. Okay, and maybe we can drop the redness so that they are not so bloodshot. Something like this. Remember, we can change the shape and texture of the iris. Now, if you want to paint the eye texture instead, we can't simply go to texture paint because we are working with a generated geometry. So instead, make a copy of the eyes, remove the targeting object. Also, let's not have any of the eye and iris squish, and let's have a single eye. Alright, now this we can convert into a mesh. The UV map will be generated, so we can paint on it. But before that, let's get back to the shading. Give it back the eye material. Just make sure we are focusing on that object, okay? Then, let's create a new image texture. And then we can paint on that texture. And you can see that reflected on the other eyes. So, you can paint whatever you want. I'm just demonstrating here. We can still use the targeting. If you want, you can use this paint texture somewhere inside of the material. Let's say over here. That way you can use the bump or some other things. And I'd say we are done with this video. It was a long one, but we've done a lot. Feel free to tweak the material or add more geometry features. I've just shown you a few concepts here. But yeah, I'll have a more cleaned up version of this, as well as any node tools like this in the description. Hope you found all this useful. I'll see you next time.